Christina Lepore, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you for having me, David.
Well, it's so great to have you here. And you're going to be discussing your healing journey through complex PTSD and dissociative identity disorder. And so I want to thank you in advance for being willing to go into such personal material.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and I want to note that it's not only personal, but really your own personal experiences have led to a very strong professional interest. And you become a licensed mental health worker, and you're a blogger, and you found other ways to work it into your professional life, right?
Absolutely, yes. It's very personal to me, very dear to my heart.
Yeah. So maybe we should start with your family of origin, and you can kind of tell us about your early growing up years, and I'm assuming that we're going to be talking about some sort of traumatic event somewhere in those years. But give us the background. We're just going to have a conversation. I don't have a lot of detail.
No, that's okay. So I was raised in a very sort of traditional, I don't think the word normal is appropriate because what's normal, right?
Right.
Very traditional sort of white picket fence family. My father was a white collar businessman who worked for Grand Trunk Rail in Detroit, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. Very protective family, devoutly Catholic, extremely strict, but not in an abusive way, which is to say that these things happen in good homes too. And I think that's important to say, because I think a lot of people, when they hear these type of podcasts, they automatically, I read the comments and it's like, where were the parents? Where were the parents? Where were the parents? And it's not always, that's not always the case.
Right.
In my particular case, it wasn't that my parents were absent. It was just, I grew up in a generation that, well, and still very much, it's still very true. I mean, we've trained our children to look for the odd introvert who's driving a white cargo van, to be alert to, strangers who walk the streets at night, or, maybe the homeless guy on the street. Like these are the people that we're told to be alert and afraid of, and we teach our kids to not talk to strangers. And unfortunately, a lot of sexual abuse of children happens predominantly by people that they know. And so that's something that I think this generation is still working on, and we're not doing a very good job at protecting our children, because we're not educating them about who are the predators, and that they kind of hide in plain sight among us, and they use their authority and their power as an armor so that they're able to hide in plain sight. And so how we teach our children to be about coaches, teachers, priests, people in positions of authority, that's something that I think even in this generation, we're not quite sure how to have that conversation yet.
Well, what happened to you, and at what age?
Well, I know that something happened before the age of 4, around 4. I only have bits and pieces of it. I can't see the face of the perpetrator. But something did happen. The ones that are most memorable is when I was 8, I was molested by someone at a family barbecue. It wasn't a family member, but it was someone who was there. And then again the following year, and unfortunately it was sort of a grooming situation where I really believed, it's hard to understand because I was so young, but I really believed that my love for this person implied consent. And so it took me till just a couple of years ago to realize that I wasn't somehow consensual in this relationship, even though I was 10 and they were 40, because I was groomed to believe things like, in 6 years, when you're 16, I'm going to marry you, or, you're my girl and you're perfect and we just have to keep this secret, and, just long enough to to be able to sort of bring it out of the closet. It just has to be a secret for now. And so that was, that one's a really hard one to pick apart, because it feels like a violation, but more like almost on a spiritual gut level, and I have a lot of shame there, because I feel like I was complicit in it somehow, which I know now, as at my age, that's not rational. But
right. But at a deeper level, you're still dealing with that and working with that. So this was like a friend of the family or an acquaintance of the family?
It was somebody who worked in the school that I attended at the time.
Ah, okay.
And I started to develop, so all along, sort of my body has told my story without me ever opening my mouth and speaking the actual words. And so I started to develop very severe abdominal pain, and I was vomiting a lot, and I had irritable bowel-like symptoms. Sorry, and I was out of school. My parents were taking me from doctor to doctor, specialist to specialist, blood work. Nobody was able to find a reason for why I was having these stomach aches, and so I think I knew in my young child mind that it was my body alerting me that something was wrong. But the irony is that no doctor ever asked. And so, no one ever asked those questions. Was there something else going on that might be causing this? They were looking at, so the organ of expertise, right? Pediatrician looks at one thing, GI looks at something else.
Right.
They're looking at the organs. They're not really asking the bigger questions.
Yeah. So what was the impact of this on your school experience?
Well, so what happened was, after about 6 months, I decided that I was going to tell someone what was going on, because he had made a way in with my family. So he had been over to my family's house for lunch multiple times. He was always in church with my family, and so he had not just groomed me, but he'd also groomed my parents.
Yes, right.
And so I didn't really know what to do, so I decided that I was going to tell someone, not my parents, but I did confide in a trusted adult, and that person who I confided in me sexually abused me. So that was
Oh my God, the person that you confided in also sexually abused you.
Yes, they didn't. I'm not naming names or whatever, but it was in a confessional. So because I was devoutly Catholic, I went to the priest on Holy Thursday before Easter at one of those services where there's hundreds of school kids, and there's priests scattered throughout the whole sanctuary. And I chose one with the door because I didn't want anyone to hear. And I was, not believed. I was shamed. I was blamed. I was asked to come across. If you know anything about Catholic Church, you sort of sit on a pew and speak through a screen so the person can't see you.
Yes.
And the priest asked me to come onto the other side where he could actually see me, to have a conversation, to see if he could tell from my facial expressions whether I was telling the truth or not. So not only did he condemn me and tell me things like I was making up stories, or I had a dirty mind, or I was going to grow up to be a tramp when I was a teenager, and that I needed to stop lying. He also insisted that if I was telling the truth, that I show him.
Oh, brother.
What I was.
Brother. Yeah.
What was going on with this other person?
Yeah.
So
leaping ahead, I have to wonder, what is your relationship with the Catholic Church at this point in your life?
Oh, that's a whole other story. It's been very, it's hard to. There's a man who's very involved here in Canada, John Swales. I don't know if you know much about him in the States, but he's a big advocate right here in Ontario. And so he's been very supportive of helping me because of his similar situation. Nonetheless, it's really been hard, because I feel like I feel, violated and used and abused. And yet by the
Yeah.
same token, I felt like if I left the church, that I was giving up on God, and that was somehow, that I couldn't do that. And so I did sort of, I had my I got married in that church. I had my children baptized in that church. I stuck to the status quo of my family. And then when I was in my 20s, I left and I went and joined someplace else. And then I ended up completely giving up on it altogether and becoming more of an agnostic. And now I'm sort of finding my way back to faith, because I think that
Mhm.
spirituality is a really core, important part of balance, right? Of mind, body, spirit. It doesn't have to be God. It can just be like your sense of purpose
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
meaning in life. So I try to stay focused more on the heart of the Gospels and not so much the clericalism and the religious doctrine. Um,
Yes.
but when this happened to me, I didn't know, of course, that any other children in the world were going through this.
Right. Unfortunately, there's so many cases, and it's been a big problem in the church.
And it's the secrecy, right? Like
Yeah.
nobody's talking about it. And then when people finally did start talking about it, it was mostly boys. And I thought, well, I'm an isolated incident because I'm a girl. And so really it's only been in the last couple years that I've been able to get my head around the fact that it doesn't really matter what my gender is. It's a predatory behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Wow,
but
what a journey! I must say, that's a lot to have to overcome and to integrate and so on. And I imagine that somewhere along the line, you must have sought out one or more kinds of therapy.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, I ended up getting, I went to, I mean, when I don't really have any so this happened when I was in grade 5, and I have hardly any memories of grade 6, 7, 8, very just fragments here and there, like graduation or a dance or a carnival, but very, very distant and vague. And throughout my adolescence, I had a lot of issues with like depersonalization and derealization, like, looking in the mirror and then looking back into my bed to see if I was still there, not really feeling like I belonged,
Wow.
or
Yeah.
almost like I was standing outside of myself, like looking through, I don't know, I would use the example of like a frosted glass window where I was there, but I wasn't inside.
Yes.
And so this started in my adolescence, and I was in an abusive relationship as a teenager, and re-victimization is common, unfortunately. And so that, again, those same symptoms that I had as a child began to present themselves again at 16 with the
Yeah.
DI issues. Only now I was having full-blown panic attacks, and I had stopped eating. So an electrolyte imbalance sent me to hospital, and that was the first time that I got therapy, was at 16. Was
Uh-huh. So
Yeah.
it's almost as if the predatory, usually males, the predatory males somehow pick up on the vulnerability, the already existing vulnerability from earlier incidents. It's as if there were an odor or something that they could sense and pick up on, or
I,
something
I
in
thank you so much.
behavior, of a child who's been pre-sexualized, if you will.
I thank you for saying that, because I think when you ask questions about re-victimization, a lot of people will put it back on the victim, that they have low self-esteem, that they have low self-worth, and we do. But
Yeah.
it's far bigger than that. I think it's more to do with, putting it back where it belongs, which is with the predator and the predatory instinct of people to be able to, target specific people that they know are shy, vulnerable, withdrawn, that are easy targets.
Mhm.
And also, I think my hypervigilance, even though I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD in my teens, I think hypervigilance sometimes can lead to re-victimization, because with hypervigilance, I'm looking for a danger that no longer exists, so I don't see the danger that's right in front of me.
Ah,
I don't, what I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and there is a way in which it's kind of hard to wrap one's head around that, I think. Uh, well, I guess I could understand it from the point of view of maybe a massive internal fear that is so frightening that it blinds you to seeing it because you don't want to see it because it's too scary to admit.
Absolutely, absolutely. And your fight or flight response, it's hard to differentiate between a red flag and butterflies in your stomach because it all feels the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's a complicated disorder, definitely.
Yeah, and that's something that you've talked about and written about is dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality, and it dropped out of the psychiatric lexicon for a while, and then it came back as DID, dissociative identity disorder. And in your blog, I read a place where you were discussing it, and in terms of the process being a process of splitting, that somehow the personality becomes fractured into different parts, maybe good parts that are labeled as good and parts that are labeled as bad. And, you know, so say more about what that process was like for you as you experience it.
I don't like the term MPD at all. I'm so glad that it doesn't exist. There were so many. I think people have a reason to be skeptical of that diagnosis at the time. I'm glad they changed the name. A lot of the techniques that they used at the time of like Sybil to gain information were like sodium pentothal and hypnosis, which you can insert suggestion and repress memories that might not actually be memories because you've been inserted a suggestion. It's like if you tell somebody to quit smoking with hypnosis, you tell them they're going to quit smoking, or it's going to taste terrible. It'll taste terrible. So if you insert a false memory, somebody might actually believe that. So I'm glad that we don't call it that anymore. I mean, I think MPD is more like an idea of having multiple people, whereas dissociative identity disorder is just not even having one.
Yeah, so that was not your experience, but your experience was more, for one thing, these areas of darkness that you have no memory of, the sort of holes in your memory, right? That you don't know exactly what happened.
I think we all, I think everybody, I think of dissociation as a spectrum disorder, and we all dissociate. So if you're driving home and and you're listening to the radio and you're thinking about things, and then you suddenly end up in your driveway and you're like, how did I get here?
Right. You went, oh my God, I could have had an accident or something.
Exactly, but you're not quite sure how you did it, but you got home, we dissociated. So that would be at the very, one end of it, with the other extreme being complete amnesia. For the most part, I have co-consciousness with a lot of it, whereas I was always there, but almost like I was seeing it from a distance. But there are other things where I do have complete blanks.
Yeah.
EMDR has really helped with trying to connect those dots, which is the therapy that I use for the treatment of both the PTSD.
Yeah. And EMDR. Remind us of what that stands for.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Yes, that's it. And I actually had a chance years ago to interview the woman who created
Francine Shapiro.
Yeah, I interviewed her on my Wise Counsel podcast. I block on people's names. That's where my and I are. And at the time, because it was still new then, I maybe was a little bit skeptical, about it. But later, she sent me this big, thick book that was all the research that had been done on it, and so it's very solidly established now as one of just two or three things that for approaches that is sort of very much scientific credibility could be invested in it in EMDR.
And it's a FDA approved and a veterans approved treatment for PTSD. And it doesn't require medication, although I am on medication, but, and it doesn't, insert memories, or there's no risk of that. As you probably know, there's different theories of how it works. Some people think that the eye movement back and forth stimulates the brain bilaterally. Other people think it simulates REM sleep. So, like with rapid eye movement during sleep, it sort of helps us process the day's events that EMDR allows for processing by simulating that movement. I don't think they know definitively exactly.
Right. I don't think they do either. I think distraction is another theory, right? That
yes.
It gets your conscious mind occupied with something here and leaves more space for the unconscious to bubble up.
Yeah, I've had very incredible results with, I've tried everything. I've tried hypnosis. I've tried, SSRIs, SNRIs, atypicals, benzos, sort of everything in the book in terms of medication. CBT, I'm doing that now that I'm better, but at one time it was very, I could not do it at all. I think, the sort of CBT, DBT, mindfulness are very in vogue right now, but if you have DID and you have to be within the window of tolerance for CBD to work. And if your fight or flight response is, firing off alarms, your prefrontal cortex can't engage.
Right.
So for your cognitive brain to engage in CBT, you have to be within that window of tolerance, and I wasn't. So now that I am within there, I am able to do some of the CBT. And the mindfulness, like that helps me now, but at the time, it's really important that we don't treat generalized anxiety disorder the same as we do with trauma anxiety, because one is a fear of the unknown or a anticipatory fear, and the other is a fear of something that's already happened.
Yeah.
And for me, mindfulness was very triggering and destabilizing. It caused me to go really downhill and end up in the hospital because it forces you to focus on your body, which is something that a person who's experienced trauma does not want to do. And so you have to stay in there and listen to what your body's telling you. I wasn't ready for that. But now that I'm better, I find it helpful.
Yeah, it's interesting that a whole new specialty pretty much has arisen of trauma-informed therapy. And there are a number of therapies. But as we begin to understand more about trauma and the impact of it and how it impacts the brain and kind of steals, the fear side of the brain and the prefrontal cortex, the thinking and being able to be logical and reasonable about things, that's kind of shunted away to the side and not easily accessed in the early stages. And so therapists are learning that they have to be careful not to be triggering that
absolutely
fear complex.
Because if a rabid dog was to run into this room right now, my cognitive brain isn't going to be wondering, why is there a dog in this room? It's just going to want me to get up and fight, flee, or freeze. And so you can't have rational thoughts when your brain is stuck in fear mode or survival mode. So you have to be able, and EMDR sort of brings you down from it diminishes. It has that effect on the amygdala of reducing the activation, which is, very important to healing, is bringing down the levels of activation in the brain. I'm actually going to be a part of a study that's going to, functional MRI study of the impact of moral injury on the brain that actually looks at the structural and, connects of the brain and which areas light up and which areas don't with people with complex PTSD. It's a study out of Western University here in London.
In London, Ontario, where you are in Canada, right? Mm-hmm. Did you say you're part of that study?
Yes. So I'm excited to see what my brain images will look like when we're done.
So you're right at the beginning of that, huh?
Yes, well, I'm very lucky to have a psychiatrist here in London who specializes in PTSD. She's got over 150 published, journals between Canada, the US, and England, and she is, right here in my own city, and she actually works with predominantly people with trauma and several people with DID, which I'm not the only patient, so that's nice.
Yeah.
So she
I know that you were considering inviting her to be in the interview, and I think that would have been challenging with somebody who's probably as busy as she is professionally.
just because we're still in working on things,
Yeah,
it would have been probably, there's the risk of violating my confidentiality. So
yeah, yeah. So that sounds like the wise decision. Do you think she would mind your saying her name so that other people can think of her as a resource if they're maybe in that part of the world or want to travel?
Oh, I probably shouldn't without her permission. I'm sorry, but if
Okay.
somebody wants to
Okay,
private
great.
message me, I can
That's
ask
fine.
her after the show and see if she's okay with that. I don't want to have her suddenly flooded with patients.
Yeah, okay, I understand. So jumping back into the chronology, now the high school is, did you go to Catholic
I
schooling
did.
all the way through?
Yes, all the way through.
And what about college?
I went to something happened right in my sort of first year of college again that sort of solidified was the icing on the cake. I was sexually assaulted after a night of being out at a club for somebody's birthday, and after that happened, um, I just made a decision. My father had a massive stroke after he found out that happened to me, and at the time I blamed myself. I thought it was all my fault,
Oh,
and that I had caused him so much pain that
wow.
I was to blame.
Yeah.
And so I decided at that time to pack it all up. So I basically took all of my trauma, visually, if you can visualize, and put it in a box, marked it, fragile, don't open, handle with care, and shoved it
Wow.
to the back of my brain
Yeah.
where it wasn't coming out. And I went to school, became a nurse, got married, started a family. And as long as I kept really busy, which was what, so I ran a treatment home for high risk youth. So I was doing that. I was working at the London Psychiatric Hospital. I was working at the General Hospital. My husband at the time had 2 jobs. We had 4 kids. So my life was so chaotic and busy that I never had time to think about my past. And then
Wow. Yeah.
when my daughter was born, it started to creep in. I have 3 boys and a girl. And so for some reason, the boys didn't trigger any memories. But as Alicia's milestones hit, the ages where I had been abused, I found myself very triggered. And then in 2011, which was for her going into grade 5, it was sort of picture day of grade 5, and she was in the washroom, sort of trying to get ready for picture day. And I could see her out of the corner of my eye, sort of adjusting her scarf and layering her clothes, because, you're starting to bud a bit and you're very self-conscious of your body. And
Hmm.
I realized, how young she was and how tiny she was, how
Yeah.
little she was. And in that mirror, I didn't see my daughter. I saw myself, and
Sure.
I lost it. And the
Oh
next 2
boy.
years after that, between 2011 and 2013, I just descended into a horrible abyss of depression that was so severe, I really wasn't even functional. I was up maybe 3 or 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time I was sleeping. I was barely speaking. I was almost catatonic. So I went into hospital in January 2013, and then that's when I, found out that I actually had, that it wasn't just major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, or panic disorder, agoraphobia. I had multiple labels, but bipolar 2, like multiple layer, but finally got a diagnosis of PTSD with dissociative DID. NOS was the original diagnosis, and then it's become clearer over time that it's DID. So
Yeah. And you refer to it as complex DID, which is a diagnostic term that I've recently heard of in doing these interviews, but not everybody may not be familiar with that kind of variant. What's your version of explaining what's meant by complex DID?
Oh, so
Excuse me, complex PTSD.
no worries. Complex PTSD. So really the difference is just PTSD can be a singular event. So it could be a traffic accident. It could be seeing a bomb explode. It could be what first responders go through, being on the scene of a horrific accident. It could be just one event. The term complex PTSD alludes to a series.
Yeah, that's my understanding of it as well. And so particularly in this situation where it wasn't a one-time thing, there were multiple incidents in different settings and so on.
Yes.
Which would mean that, to me, that it would generalize even more to the world would become an even more dangerous seeming place. Because if it's just one thing, you could maybe avoid that one thing, but
absolutely,
it's such an assault on your sense of trust.
I had gotten to the point where there was nowhere that was safe. So the only place that felt safe to me was home. So I didn't leave my house for months. And then eventually home didn't even become a safe place. So that's when I went into hospital and got some help. So it was helpful in the sense too to be with other people who were experiencing this, because I felt very alone and isolated, of course, because no one else around me really understood what was going on. And it's hard too when you work in mental health care to get on the other side of the medication window and to be the patient when you're usually the caregiver. So but it was the best thing I ever did for myself.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm so glad that you did. I pulled out a couple of quotes from your blog that you sent me that I think I'd like to read here.
Sure.
And it puts me in mind of, that Freud's original theory related to childhood sexual experiences, what we would today call sexual abuse. It was so unthinkable by the medical profession at large that he kind of abandoned that and moved it to, it was fantasies.
Yes, the Oedipus theory.
Sexual ideas that children had. But the statistics are just shocking. And these are some of the things that you quote here. You quote the journal PubMed. According to PubMed, 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys will be assaulted before the age of 18.
Terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, that's just amazing. It goes on to say the United States Department of Justice reports that 90% of child sexual abuse victims know or have some form of a relationship with their abuser.
Yes.
And again, it's such an assault on trust that this person that who's either in your family, your school, or some other trusted relationship, your camp counselor, whatever.
Absolutely.
Just a deep assault on trust. And it goes on to say, shockingly, the McGill Journal of Medicine states that the lifetime prevalence of PTSD for women who have been sexually assaulted is 50%. Now that's shockingly high, because when you look at the percentage of veterans who've had wartime PTSD, the percentage is much lower.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's much lower. I'm not good at remembering all the statistics, but it might even be as low as 2%.
Wow.
It's dramatically different. That many people come through those soldiers. They come through those experiences, horrible experiences, but somehow they had enough positive early life experiences, probably,
Mhm.
or some form of faith or something, that they had the resilience to bounce back,
Yeah.
which is great. I mean, it's good that human beings have inner strengths and inner resources, and it's some have more of that than others, and some of it is even genetic, thought to
Yeah.
be, and so on.
I
Uh,
don't even think of it so much as resiliency as so much as I think, when I was in hospital, I was in a PTSD program that was all inclusive. So it was whether you were sexually abused or whether you were a first responder or whether you were military, we were all together. And at first I thought that was unusual, because I thought that their experience were so much bigger than mine. How
yeah.
could and then, of course, the opposite. They thought mine was so much bigger than theirs.
Uh-huh.
I think the key piece is the moral injury piece. I think for people who have been to war or first responders, I think they can get their head around a bit the part that they're not necessarily responsible for what's happened.
Mhm.
Whereas with acts of sexual abuse or sexual violence, there's always that fear that somehow you're responsible or complicit, or there's something you would have, could have, should have done differently, and
Yeah,
that shame piece is so much greater. I'm not saying
yeah,
that veterans don't have shame too. I'm sure they
right.
do. I just think the shame piece amongst sexual abuse victims is a lot greater.
Yeah, it's different. Yeah, I appreciate your putting that out there.
It is just a hypothetical thought. I mean, we all struggle. One of my good friends, who I talk to regularly on Facebook, is a police officer with PTSD, and so regardless of how vastly different our traumas are, our
Yeah,
experience of it, the hypervigilance, the nightmares, the crippling depression, the terrorizing panic attacks, they're all the same. So regardless of what our trauma is, our symptoms today, here in the present tense, we can talk to each other like the trauma is irrelevant because the symptoms
yeah,
are the
that's wonderful. It sounds like the group therapy experience was really an important component.
absolutely huge.
Yeah, yeah, because you have a group of people with shared experience, and therefore who they feel safe because they've been through what you've been through, and you feel you're not subjected to blame, and you don't have to be afraid that they're blaming you for your experiences.
The sanest people I've ever met in my life were in a mental hospital. I'm not joking. I mean, there is no, doesn't matter black, white, brown, we were all blue,
Yeah,
depressed. Everybody helps each other, gay, trans, straight, doesn't, atheist, it's irrelevant. Everybody lifted each other up. Everyone rooted for the other team. And so that sense of, I don't know what the word is, just feeling validated.
validated and connected to these people,
Absolutely.
and there's an aspect of of what you've been through that is a blessing. And I'm sure it didn't feel that way at the time, but it's some of what you've learned is what the rest of us need to learn, is that we're all connected, and that judging others, is not a good thing to be doing, etc.
Yeah, and it really makes your priorities very, they change.
Yeah,
You just learn to what's important, and sort of what isn't, and um,
yeah,
I,
yeah. It connects you to the bottom line of what really is important in this life and
yeah.
existence.
The DID thing bothers me a lot. The fact that some stigma has lifted, around PTSD, depression, anxiety, but there's still a lot of stigma around DID, and I don't understand it. Only because, like, one of my favorite shows was Bates Motel, and when at the end towards the end you find out that that's his diagnosis. And I don't know, I think we've done a great disservice to people with dissociative identity disorder by making them have alters that are serial killers, when we're making fun of childhood sexual abuse. This is not something that's funny. It is not something that is scary. I mean, it's terrifying for the victim, but it's unfortunate that we haven't lifted that stigma yet.
Yes, yes.
But like you said, with the taboo around sexual abuse, we were talking about the Oedipus theory and Freud, and how he, said that he thought that his patients were, I believe he had 7 women and 3 men, and he was suspected that many of them were sexually abused as children. And when he put that out to the other psychiatrists in his starting grounds of psychiatry, they didn't like it. It was taboo. So we had to switch it to this sort of attraction thing that was more accepted. And 100 years later, we're not much further ahead, because it's still such a taboo topic. Like, people do not want to discuss it. People do not want to believe it could ever happen to their children. And so I think that's really something that's important, that in terms of trauma, and I get a lot of opportunity to work with medical students, because my psychiatrist trains medical students, and that's one of the things that because they won't all go into psychiatry. Many of them are going into internal medicine or surgery or whatever, but I always, if I can give them any tips, it's to be trauma informed, because that patient there, something like a colonoscopy, very invasive. So, knowing whether or not somebody has a trauma history could completely change the experience for the patient and the doctor as well.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Asking those things. Dentistry, like, I have a huge problem with I'm terrified of going to the dentist. Just absolutely petrified. I'll wait until my face is going to blow up. But it's that whole, being lied back in a chair, having things in your mouth, not being able to move, feeling frozen, out of control. And I've been lucky enough that I found a dentist who I was able to say, I have trauma in my past. I need you to tell me what you're doing. I need you to talk me through it and get a nod of consent when you're going to start drilling or something. And if I put up my hand and say, I need you to let me sit up, I need you to let me sit up. And that was 3 things. And he said that he had received no trauma training at all in all of his years of medical school. And that, he would remember that with patients. He said on a regular basis for dentists, they get about 2 cancellations a day of people with dental phobias. And now he's realizing maybe it's bigger than that. Maybe they have some other type of trauma that they don't like being completely, out of control, laid back under somebody's, with somebody doing things invasive to them. And so
that's really important. That's you've got to write that up if you haven't already. I know you cover a lot of issues on your blog. And by the way, we haven't spoken about the writing piece for you, that I don't know if it was journaling or what, but writing somehow was a big healing force for you.
Yeah, so I wrote in a chapter in a collaborative book to raise money for sex trafficking victims. That was never my story, but I resonated with what some of those girls were going through on a trauma level. And so that was sort of the first time I openly told my story, but it was only a chapter and it was very vague. But that gave me the courage to start, speaking out more. I think Me Too is great, but it's a hashtag. It's now what, and how do we say no more? There's so many questions of, saying Me Too isn't enough. It's now, what are we going to do about it, so that the next generation of girls, so that my daughter will say no more. This is never going to happen again. So I'm very committed to advocacy in those areas. I'm writing a memoir called Frozen in Time about my personal experiences with healing from PTSD and DID. I won't say anything about the agent because it's tentative, but it's looking like it's going to get published. So I'm hoping it's going to get published traditionally. And then I'm also working on a self-help book just on, the impact of EMDR, how much it's helped me, because I think
Yeah,
a lot
good
of
for
people
you.
don't know about it, and it's been an invaluable resource. And if it can help me, it could help somebody else. And then I'm also involved in doing workshops. So I'm trying to bring trauma-informed information to sort of anyone who will listen, which is basically any type of, right now I have a few lawyers that are interested in learning about trauma-informed care. Unfortunately, we're just all in the dark, from investigating officers to the highest judges of the land. There seems to be no consensus in what they actually know about PTSD and about trauma-informed care. But even like hairdressers, I've had hairdressers reach out to me on Facebook and say, what can we do to help our clients? Like we
Wow.
hear their stories. They're like bartenders and therapists. They
Yeah.
hear people's stories all day long, and knowing how to respond to people in crisis, because there's just so many people in crisis and so much lack of care. So between the speaking engagements and the written work, my hope is to, help others to feel less alone, and to also, know that there's hope.
Yeah, boy, that's wonderful way that you're channeling and alchemically transforming your experience and taking it out to the world in very positive ways. There was one more quote I wanted to read from your blog about the ACE study, which has come up in many of the interviews that I've done over the years. And ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what we've learned is that people who've had adverse childhood experiences have just tons of physical problems.
Absolutely.
That they don't seem, quote, psychological.
Yeah.
But as you said, it gets into your body. And,
Absolutely.
yeah.
For years, that's my sort of signature. For years, my body told the story that I wasn't able to say with my words. But it wasn't, I don't like the word somatic, because it almost insinuates that it's just all in your mind and that it's not actually a brain level. And I think we know now, the science is more valid, now that we have science validating it, that, if your brain is constantly in fight or flight mode, and sending off signals of danger, it's living in a chronic toxic state of stress.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of things, like I was diagnosed with endometriosis when I was 19. I was diagnosed with degenerative disc disease when I was 28. These are typically things that happen to people that are much older.
Right.
Hypertension and supraventricular tachycardia in my 20s. Probably, I think a lot of it's related to that chronic stress, hormones, and the ACE validates that. I mean, the ACE study is terrifying. I think that every GP and every pediatrician and every doctor should have just a simple screening tool in their office, because a 4 out of 10 ACE, if you have 4 out of the 10 ACEs, you triple your chances of getting cancer. You double your chances of degenerative diseases, immune diseases, and hormonal diseases, and your life expectancy drops by 20 years. And that's right out of like the Kaiser Permanente ACE study. And if anything else was doing that to us, like if we knew that there was some type of, I don't know, preservative in our food that was decreasing life expectancy by 20 years and making us more at risk for cancer and degenerative diseases and early onset of aging diseases, we would eliminate that chemical. But for some reason, we're not eliminating childhood trauma. And so it's not just about the children being able to speak up, it's about the parents understanding that, what's going on with their children and how their actions affect their children's health long term. They say it even can it get into the epigenetic coding how DNA is read and transcribed. So the study, Dr. Nadia Burke, who's now the Surgeon General in California, is going to bring ACE studies as a screening tool to all schools and medical clinics in California. So I'm really
in California. I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, Dr. Nadine Burke. So hopefully we get that here in London, in Canada as well. But that study is just mind-boggling, because it's not just physical or sexual abuse. It looks at everything, right? Like having a parent that's mentally ill, having a parent that's incarcerated, divorce, having a parent die, addiction. It's not just sexual abuse. There's multiple adverse experiences, adversity that affects children when they become adults, and it's just so important that we can't deny it any longer. We
Right.
have to address it, as
Well,
uncomfortable as that is.
I'm really experiencing your activism here.
Sorry.
And I'm hoping that your activism will actually also be a channel for your own healing. You know, that doing this, quotes, getting it out of your system,
Yes.
really is going to get it out of your system and help with inner healing. How can people find you if somebody wants to find out more about you and your work, etc.? How can they find you online?
So I have a website. It's just ChristinaLepore.com. And then I also am on Facebook, same name, Christina Lepore. And then on Instagram, I also have an account. It's Christina Lepore 123. Nothing very exciting, but
Good. It's
it works.
memorable.
They can find me any of those routes.
Okay, well, that's good. You know, I think that this is probably a good place for us to wind it down.
Absolutely. Thank you so
Okay.
much for having me.
Yeah, Christina Lepore, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
I am honored that you had me. Thank you for letting me be here to tell my story and
Oh, yeah.
help others as well.